Questions. Questions are wonderful things, aren't they? They help us to learn about people. Oh, where are you from? Where do you work? What do you do? How many children do you have? Are you married? They are good questions, right? But we learned about these good questions back in grade school, didn't we? When we were probably in first or second grade. The who, what, when, why, how, where, all those questions that help us. And questions, they focus our attention. The questions help solve crimes. Questions help bring clarity to confusion. Questions search out one's beliefs. Oh, why do you believe that? Questions also set up arguments. And Paul is a master at using questions to set up his arguments that he wants to make clear, particularly in the book of Romans. So we've seen dozens of these throughout our study through the book of Romans, but let me just highlight a few that we have looked at in the past. In Romans 3, verse 3, what if some were unfaithful? Does their unfaithfulness nullify the faithfulness of God? He says in chapter 3:31, do we then overthrow the law by this faith? In chapter 6, verse 1, what shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin that grace may abound? In verse 15 of chapter 6, what then? Are we to sin because we're not under law but under grace? Chapter 7, verse 7, what then shall we say? That the law is sin? Romans 7:13, do that which is good, then bring death to me. And then finally in Romans 9:14, what shall we say then? Is there injustice on God's part? And I mention all those, I mean there's dozens I could bring up, but I mention all those because in every single one of those cases, Paul responds with the exact same response every single time, by no means. By no means. And as we come now to chapter 11, if you haven't turned there, turn to Romans chapter 11. We're going to look at verses 1 through 10. Paul begins this section again with another question. We're responding in the same way, by no means. But then the section, these verses can be divided into two halves. One, verse 1 through 6, which is speaking of the remnant, and then the reprobate in 7 through 10. Both sections begin with questions. Questions where Paul is setting up his argument for what he wants us to see. Now, usually at this point, I read through the text, the whole text all at once, and we go back through. But what I want to do is take Paul's argument little by little. So we'll walk through the text, and we'll read it as we go along. So let's look at the first half of this section of text that we're looking at, verses 1 through 6, the remnant. Paul begins in verse 1. He opens with that question, I ask then, has God rejected his people? Has God rejected his people? Remember, we are dealing with, in chapters 9, 10, and 11, Paul's discussion and his argument, what about the Jews? What is God doing to save the Jews? Or in a negative sense, how come very few Jews are coming to faith? And so in chapter 9, he speaks of God's sovereignty in whom he will save. I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy. And not all who are Jewish are true Jews. And then in chapter 10, he explains that Jews have a responsibility there is a responsibility in themselves for their own sinful actions. And so then he comes to chapter 11, and he basically will come and see the conclusion that Paul has there, that God is, and will save the Jews. We'll see that as we walk through this chapter. But here he asks this question, has God rejected his people? And again he responds by that common refrain throughout the book of Romans, By no means. Now, someone might say, well, Paul, you've made a claim. Do you have any proof? Can you prove that? I mean, people make claims all the time, don't they? They make claims of what is true or what is not true. We had to endure that not too long ago through COVID, where a lot of claims were made. A lot of claims based on science, right? That you had to be 6 feet apart, that you had to wear a mask, that you had to be locked in your home. Several years later, we find out through testimony under oath that all of those regulations were just made up, that there was actually no scientific evidence. And so the question for here is, what is your proof? You got to show proof. This is where questions are good. Someone makes a claim. Oh, well, explain to me. How is that true? What is your evidence for that? And so think that Paul is thinking that same thing. Okay, well, I got to show some evidence. And that's what he does in the second half of verse 1. He says, "For I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin." So he says initially, what he says here is, hey, has God forsaken the Jews? Just look at me. I'm a Jew. I'm a Jew. I am saved. God saved me. He plucked me out of my hatred towards the church, hatred towards Jesus, and He saves me out of the darkness and brought me into the kingdom of light. I am a Jew. Now, Paul could have taken the time to show us that he's not the only one. And so, because Paul didn't, I will. Not that I have any authority over Paul, but I want to expand here that Paul could have gone to the book of Acts, because at the beginning of the book of Acts, what do we have? We have how many in the upper room? 120 Jews. We have the 12 disciples, we have Mary and all the ladies who are there, and all these other people, we don't even have all their names. But they're all Jews. Peter, on that day of Pentecost, preaches the first sermon. At the end of that chapter, it says how many came to faith? 3,000 came to faith that day in Acts chapter 2, 41. In verse 47, it says that they were added to their number day by day. Jews were added to their number day by day. In chapter 4, later, we see that 5,000 men were added to their number, which means they didn't count the women and children. So we don't actually know how many. And then in chapter 5, it says, and more than ever believers were added to the Lord, multitudes of both men and women. Multitudes. Jews were being saved all over the place. So then why is this discussion even happening? Why are we saying, well, how come God's not saving the Jews? Because in comparison to the numbers that were being saved and then the numbers that existed, it was very small. And then in comparison, that number of Jews who were being saved compared to the number of Gentiles who were coming to faith, it seemed even smaller. So Paul proves or shows some proof. I am a Jew. My proof that God is saving the Jew is I'm evidence of that. And he adds to his argument in verse 2, God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Now, what is Paul doing there? He's reminding us of God's action in salvation, taking us all the way back to his explanation of the doctrines of predestination and election in chapter 8. Let me remind you, Paul writes, for those whom he foreknew, there's the same word, right? He foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, And those whom he predestined, he also called. And those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified. That golden chain of redemption. And then he also connects this same truth to what we saw in chapter 9, and where Paul is dealing with the question, what about the Jews? He takes us back to the subject of the choosing of Jacob over Esau, which the text says that in order that God's purpose of election might continue or might stand. So God has a people whom he has elected. He has foreknown, elected, predestined to salvation. So those Jews who are coming to faith are those whom God has elected, whom God has predestined, whom God has foreknown. And what Paul is saying here is that God is saving a remnant. A remnant. So he's not saving every Jew, at least not at this point. He's saving a remnant of Jews. Now what he does in verses 2 through 4, he explains to us why this is the truth, why God is saving a remnant, that it is not out of the ordinary, that it's actually God's methodology of saving a remnant for himself, for a purpose. So let me read that to you, beginning in the second half of verse 2. Do you not know what the scriptures say of Elijah? So he's taking us all the way back to the story of Elijah, and he's using Elijah as the case study of what God is doing to save a people for himself. How he appeals to God against Israel. Lord, that you have killed your prophets, that they have demolished your altars, and I alone am left, and they seek my life. But what is God's reply to him? I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. Now, let me kind of put all that in context so we know what's going on in Elijah's life, so that we can see what God's doing in what Paul is talking about in his time with the Jews. Elijah's story is a story of power, of boldness, of faithfulness and expectation, but filled with disappointment and depression and discouragement and struggle. He's called by God to give a message, and he goes to the king Ahab. Ahab is the king of the northern kingdom of Israel. At this time, the nation of Israel is split into two kingdoms, the northern kingdom Israel and the southern kingdom called Judah. And so he is sent to the northern kingdom, to Ahab. And Ahab, just so you know, was a man full of evil desires. He was an evil man. He was the son of Omri, and it says of him, he did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all those who were before him. Now, if you go back and you look at all the kings who have been the kings of Israel since it split, they were all evil. And then you get to Ahab and it says he did more evil than all of them. It goes on to speak of him. Ahab did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. So this guy was a bad dude, full of evil intent, evil ways, evil plans, evil actions, evil laws. And God sends Elijah to him and he says, look, Ahab, it's not going to rain until I say it is going to rain. And then he leaves. He goes away. And for 3 years, it doesn't rain. And the famine in the land is severe. And one day, after 3 years, he comes back and confronts Ahab again and says, I'll tell you what, let's have a showdown. You gather all of the people of Israel, and the 400 prophets of Baal and the 450 prophets of Asherah, and you come to Mount Carmel, and we'll have a showdown. And we'll climb up there, and your guys, your team, your prophets, they'll set up their altar, and I'll set up my altar, and whoever is able to call down fire from heaven, that God is God. And so they get up there, and Elijah is got the home field advantage, really. And so he says, you guys go first. They set up their altar, and all day long they are surrounding and chanting and calling on their God. And Elijah is extremely sarcastic when he's up there. Hey, shout louder. Maybe he's asleep. Maybe he's in the restroom. And I'd say that nicely because he's a little more vulgar about it. But he's taunting them. He's sarcastic with them. He's calling them out. And all day long they have nothing happens. And so, all right, guys, sit. You guys need to sit down. It's my turn. And then he 3 times has water poured over the altar and over the sacrifice, and they dig this trench, and so there's no way that any falsehood could happen, no sneakery, no trickery can happen here, because I've soaked my sacrifice so much so, if I had a match, I couldn't even light it. And he prays, and God's fire comes down and consumes the sacrifice and all the water, and they realize God, Yahweh, is the God of Israel. And so Elijah commands that all the prophets be slaughtered as judgment against them. Now, Elijah has an expectation here. He thinks there's going to be this great revival, that all of Israel is going to turn back to God because God showed himself in such a mighty and majestic and powerful way. But that's not what happens. Like 10 seconds after this whole event happens, Jezebel, the evil queen, Ahab's wife, threatens Elijah to kill him. I'm coming for you, Elijah. And so he freaks out and he goes into hiding. And later he ends up at the mountain of God, at Mount Horeb, the very mountain where Moses receives the 10 Commandments. The mountain where God spoke to Moses for 40 days and 40 nights. And he finds a cave in there, and he enters that cave, and he's full of fear. And God speaks to him. What are you doing here, Elijah? What are you doing here? Elijah's response, I have been very jealous for the Lord God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, this is a heavy emphasis on, I'm the only one left, and now they're seeking my life. So God speaks to him, and in that moment, and he's in that cave, a great wind tears across the mountain, breaking up the rocks. But the text says God wasn't in the wind. And then a great earthquake comes and shakes the mountain, and God is not in the earthquake. And then a great fire flashes by, but God is not in the fire. Then Elijah hears this low whisper. And let me just add a note. This is an aside to what we're dealing with, but it's an aside. This low whisper that Elijah hears is an audible whisper. It is not the still small voice that you're to hear from God that's in your heart. That is not the context. That is not what's happening here. That is not the application of that text. So if anybody tells you you need to hear the still small voice of God and points to this text, they are wrong. That's not what's happening. It's an audible voice. He's hearing with his physical ears the low whisper. And he holds his cloak tight to him, and he goes out and he covers his face because he senses God is in that low whisper. And God asks him again, "Why are you here, Elijah?" And Elijah responds in the same way, "I'm the only one left." What are you doing here, God? You see, Elijah had an expectation that there was going to be a mass revival, that God's power and authority would be shown, and people will see that, and they'll respond, and they'll run back to God and worship Him in all holiness, and come back to their senses and reject all the false gods. He expected, because there was power shown to the people, that people would repent. And when God shows Elijah all that power, the earthquake and the rocks being torn, the wind tearing the rocks, and the fire that comes by, he's like, and then the low whisper, what he's saying to Elijah is, "Look, Elijah, I have shown myself in power. But that's not how I always work. And actually, most of the time, I'm working in quiet resolution." Because God wasn't there to bring a great revival. He was working a plan of redemption. You know when Elijah found out what God's plan was? There's a day that Jesus went up to the mountain. John and James and Peter joined him, and he's transfigured there. And who appears there but Moses and Elijah? And Elijah there at that point has been made known that the revival he is looking wasn't coming through the power of strength, but the emphasis of weakness of Jesus dying on a cross. But his response to him and Elijah at this point is, "Look, you're not the only one. I'm in charge here, Elijah. I have reserved for myself 7,000 men. You're not the only one in all of Israel. Of all the millions of people that exist there, I've at least saved for myself 7,000 men." And Paul's point is that God is working in the same way. Look at verse 5. "So too, at present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace." That God is saving the Jews, a remnant of the Jews, a small portion of the Jews at this time by grace. And then he adds this emphasis on this grace in verse 6. "But if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace would be no longer be grace." And here in this one verse, Paul captures the very essence of the book of Romans, and really the essence of what the gospel is about. That it is salvation by grace alone and not by works. And we've repeated that theme over and over and over again in Romans. And why does Paul repeat that through Romans? Because we have hard hearts. Because we have deceptive hearts. Because we often always try to figure out a way, how can I work for my salvation? Even in the most subtle way. But if you believe in any bit that you're adding to your salvation, even the smallest possible amount through your works, then your salvation is not by grace. If there's even one work that adds to your salvation, it is not salvation by grace alone, but salvation by works. Now, think of it this way. We hear a lot about in the news about fentanyl, how deadly it is. And I was like, well, how deadly is it? So 2 milligrams of fentanyl could kill someone. Now, I had to look this up too. I mean, what's 2 milligrams? 2 milligrams of anything, fentanyl, is the equivalent of 5 to 7 grains of salt. You take that salt shaker that you take, that's more than 5 to 7 grains, right? So 1 little shake of the salt shaker. I mean, think of that. Put that in an 8-ounce glass of water. You put a shake of salt in there, you probably wouldn't even taste it. It's so little. 5 to 7 grains would seem like nothing, but it's enough to kill you. And that's what, when we add works to our salvation, we attempt to add works, it's like adding the 2 milligrams of fentanyl to your soul, and that's deadly. It'll kill you. It won't save you, it'll kill you. So we have grace alone is what saves. That's Paul's point, that God is saving a remnant by grace alone for his purpose, and he has a purpose. Now we'll see that purpose next week, and then the following week as we finish chapter 11, we'll see what God is doing. Why is God limiting now the Jews to only a remnant? He has a purpose. But Paul goes on to deal with that. Not only is there a remnant in verses 1 through 6, but there's the reprobate that he discusses in 7 through 10. And it begins with another question in verse 7. What then? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking? So he's creating the argument. So, hey, they're seeking salvation. And we looked at that. We saw that in chapter 10. That they were seeking it and they had a zeal for God, but not based on knowledge. They had a desire to be righteous before God, but that righteousness was not true righteousness in God. It was self-righteousness in their obedience to God's law, and ultimately not even to God's true law, to the laws they made up, the man-made laws they made, in order to think that they were following God's laws. And so Paul is provoking them in this way to say, hey, did they fail to obtain what they were seeking? And the answer is yes. It's epitomized, if you would, in the Johnny Lee song from the movie Urban Cowboy. Some of you are older might remember that movie. But the song goes, I was looking for love in all the wrong places, looking for love in too many faces. That's what the Jews were doing. They were looking for righteousness in all the wrong places instead of God himself. And then Paul adds clarity here. The elect obtained it, but the rest were hardened. So there are people God is saving, but all the other Jews who have been looking for their righteousness in all the wrong places, they have been hardened. And he explains this by drawing out from the Old Testament, from the law and from the prophets and from the Psalms, helping us understand what God is doing with those Jews who are being hardened. In verse 8, he combines two texts, one from Deuteronomy 29:4 and the other from Isaiah 29:10. So he kind of draws them and smashes them together. And he says in verse 8, as it is written, this is why he doesn't specify where it's written, because he's taking from multiple places. As it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that would not see and ears that would not hear, down to this very day. And then he adds from Psalm 69, 22 and 23, in verses 9 and 10 of Romans, and David says, let their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution for them. Let their eyes be darkened so that they cannot see, and bend their backs forever. Now the question is how we understand what God is doing. That he is essentially blinding their eyes, and he's the one that is causing them to stumble. We have to understand what God is doing. It's a judicial response to their own sin. It's a self-induced judgment. It's them facing the consequences of their own sin. One of the things that is often, it's ingrained in my memory of a childhood event that my brother and I, my sister owned, I don't even know if they make them anymore, but spin art. You guys remember spin art? It's where you put a little card in this machine and it would spin, and you drop drops of paint and it would spin it all over and kind of make it all like tie-dye kind of looking stuff, right? And, spin art. Well, one day I snuck, he was in one room in the house and I was in another room, and our cousin was babysitting us, and I snuck by the kitchen where she was working and came into my brother's room, and at that time we had lock on the door, never again, but we had a lock on the door then, and we locked the door, and we decided, hey, it's not enough to do the paint on the card. That's nice, but that's not quite as fun as painting the wall. And so we took these, I think there was 4 colors there. We took these colors and we painted the wall. Well, my dad did not appreciate us painting the wall. And so we faced the consequences of our decisions. And in those days, and I rightly deserved every bit of it, but we got spanked. We never did that again. But this is what's happening. When you're sinning against God and rebelling against God, and you're showing hatred towards God, even though you're saying you're representing God, but truly you're not, then God is, if you're seeking righteousness in other places, in all the wrong places, then God is going to give you over into your sin. So He's going to harden your heart, blind your eyes in judgment. Stephen Ewell responds to this in this way. He says, when God hardened the rest, what did He do? He didn't stop them from doing something they wanted to do, right? They wanted to sin, and so He let them keep sinning. He didn't make them do something they didn't want to do. It's not like they wanted to stop sinning, so He didn't prevent them from doing them. And He willingly permitted them to do what was already in their hearts. So in a sense, God is passively, He's just allowing them to do what their desires are, and then creating more and more judgment for themselves. Well, what can we learn from that? How does that apply to us today? What does that even matter, right? Paul's talking about the Jews in his day. We're in our day, a couple thousand years later. So what can we do here? Well, first, we should know that every unbeliever is never seeking what they're looking for. They're never finding what they're seeking. Right? Someone might desire salvation. You hear this often where people will say, well, I'm spiritual but not religious. Right? They're looking for something in life. As Pascal says, that there is a God-shaped hole in our hearts that people are looking for, or as God Himself says in the book of Ecclesiastes, that He's put eternity in the hearts of men. There is a desire. There's a knowledge of God and a desire for God, but these people are looking for God in all the wrong places. They're looking for salvation in all the wrong places. And they're blind, and they're asleep, and they're spiritually dead and in bondage to their sin. So anyone who has not come to faith in Christ lives in that condition. And so we just have to understand that everyone around us is in that condition. And it's only an act of God that can actually bring them out of their stupor, out of their sleep, out of their blindness. And that comes through the proclamation of the gospel. Secondly, we can understand that God's purposes are not always clear to us. Paul says we see in a mirror darkly. It's dim. We don't know what God is doing. We don't even know what God's doing in our own life, let alone someone else's life. And oftentimes when God is doing, he doesn't even often tell us. And so when we see evil rise up, when we see bad things happen, we don't know what God's doing. Elijah felt that way. God, what are you doing? And he really didn't explain himself. He just says, look, I have 7,000 people left. Now go do and finish your work. That's when he went and picked up Elisha and became his apprentice and then handed that mantle over to him sometime later. God doesn't explain himself. He doesn't need to explain himself, and he has no requirement to tell you exactly what he's doing. And so we have to understand that it's not always clear. We also need to know that God's grace is a sovereign grace, that he will give grace to whom he will. He will have mercy upon whom he will have mercy. But finally, more than anything else, if we've come to faith in Christ, it's because God was gracious and merciful to us, and that should cause us to be humble. Not only to each other, but even to our unbelieving friends. We can't look to our neighbor, well, I must have been better than my neighbor because God saved me and not him. That's not how it works. And so we should be humble that God has shown his grace to us, that we become really part of the remnant whom God is saving. And we should bow a knee in humility to him for his sovereign grace in our life. Well, let's close in prayer.